Thank you for your patience. If anyone knows how to resuscitate an electrocuted mouse, I think we may need a little help after that. Well, there went that joke for the night, so we'll just gotta let that go. We really appreciate your patience, and we appreciate you being here tonight for another NEH lecture here at Georgia College. We're pleased to have with us tonight professor, author, and poet Sarah Gordon, a name that most of you know. She was that's partly because of how her reputation precedes her. Having been named in 2014 as one of the 125 most influential individuals in the history of Georgia College. And if they were outdoing the top influential people in the history of Flannery O'Connor scholarship, she could make a much shorter list because she has had a huge role to play in our field. The reason for this honor is that she's had such long service to the college and to O'Connor. For the college, she came here after an undergraduate degree from Randolph-Macon Women's College, an MA from the University of Missouri, and a PhD from Texas Christian University. Once here, she became involved with O'Connor, serving for 10 years as the associate editor for the Flannery O'Connor Bulletin, starting in 1983. I believe that was volume 2. She would take over the editorship of the journal in 1983, and she would edit it for 20 years before overseeing the transition from the Bulletin into Flannery O'Connor Review. For those of you who are here for the NEH, you've seen plenty of examples of the kind of work that the Review does in your shelves and in the boxes we had for you when you arrived. At the same time, during her time as editor, she contributed to Dunn and Drigger's The Manuscripts of Flannery O'Connor at Georgia College, still an essential guide to the archive here at Georgia College. And with Margaret Witt, she developed the index to the Flannery O'Connor Bulletin. She's also published one of the most distinguished monographs on O'Connor, Flannery O'Connor, The Obedient Imagination, from the University of Georgia Press, which in the same year, she also published Flannery O'Connor in Celebration of Genius. In 2008, she added another volume to her O'Connor work, a literary guide to Flannery O'Connor's Georgia, a winner of the Governor's Award in the Humanities, and this at a time when governors still knew what humanities were. Now is my political joke for the night. Since her retirement as professor emerita, she is focused on her writing and presentations, especially as a poet, publishing 2 volumes that I happen to be familiar with, Distances in 1999, The Lost Thing in 2002, and you have a new volume coming out from Mercer, 6 White Horses, which is going to appear 2025. Thank you for that. Along with these books of poems, she has had her individual poems appear in reviews and journals such as Christianity and Literature, Swanee Review, Georgia Review, Shenandoah, Confrontation, and Southern Poetry Review. In all her work, Sarah brings a strong feminist ethic and a keen, unflinching eye for detail. In all her relationships, she brings encouragement. I remember finding all of these things when she commented quite clearly and rightly about a paragraph in my first submission to the Bulletin back in the time the Flintstones were still driving their car. I hope that it has made me a better scholar. But Sarah, I will not hold you responsible for anything I've written without you taking a pencil to it. It's a pleasure to have Sarah Gordon here with us for this institute. If you're here for the institute, I encourage you to listen to her, to pick her brain. Your work will be the better for it. But now it's time for Sarah speaking tonight on, in retrospect, memorable one-liners and the one hard line. Professor Sarah Gordon.
The technical side of this presentation, which is beyond me. You can tell I'm a little old for this. But I'm adjusting. Well, as Hazel Moat said to Mrs. Wally B. Hitchcock on the train, I reckon you think you've been redeemed. After this wait, I bet you do. Not so long ago, I had a great revelation. I had been reading and thinking about Flannery O'Connor for 60 years. Just for me to even say that bowls me over. I was introduced to her work in college, read her for the first time with great gusto in my first year in graduate school, and secured a one-year appointment as an instructor here at her alma mater in 1968. I know you're counting out. I'm 81. I returned in 1973, and by that time, Regina O'Connor had donated Flannery's library, or much of it, and her typescripts, some 7,000 pages, to the college. That was a great, great gift. And they came, the manuscripts came in these great big boxes, and they had to be sorted out. And so it was Robert Dunn, and then eventually me, and going after Stephen to see that everything was collated appropriately, and it was fascinating. I never knew I was a textual critic, but I became one. So that's the skinny of my career. I retired in 2003, 20 years ago. You are here, and you are here. You know those maps in national parks that say, you are here? Well, you are here. This is ground zero. Perhaps you'd like to know a little bit about O'Connor's history at Georgia College. First of all, what fascinates me most now in this season of my life is the changing response that I have had in these 60 years to Flannery's fiction. Initially, on snowy days and searingly hot days in Columbia, Missouri, in the mid-60s, I was absolutely captivated by O'Connor's humor. The stories in A Good Man Is Hard to Find were true to the banality and absurdity, honestly, of the South that, in spite of myself, I've always loved, North Carolinian. I found myself reading those one-liners aloud to friends. We began to recite them back and forth to each other. Craig Amison and I became experts at doing this on campus. Some of you have heard of that exchange. The stories were thigh-slapping hilarious. I knew these people, the grandmother, the nasty kids in the back seat, the proud Mr. Head who becomes overwhelmed by the city, Lucy Nell Crater and her afflicted daughter, Lucy Nell, Mrs. McIntyre's veiled, condescending camaraderie with her hired help, Mrs. Shortley. Oh yes, I saw my friends, my family, and sometimes even myself. And then, Wise Blood, after the stories I read the first publication. Hazel Notes was first simply an amusing character to me, and poor Enoch Emery reminded me of some of my country classmates in high school. To be honest, these were people in life and in fiction to whom I could feel some connection and to whom often I could feel superior. You get the picture. O'Connor appealed to me almost solely on the basis of her wildly recognizable images of Southern characters, folks I had decided to leave behind in my journey away from home. That is to say, a small town in North Carolina. In my view, provincial and intellectual, anti-intellectual people, a future to be avoided. Now, it's a bit hard to remember how I first realized that O'Connor was, in Walker Percy's words, on to something. As Percy writes, to become aware of the possibility of the search is to be on to something. Not to be on to something is to be in despair. I perked up at least to some of what O'Connor was on to. I continue to be on the possibility of the search. That search has been underway since my high school days, and it led me to the Catholic Church. a journey precipitated during my time in Missouri by a very close friend who was a convert and a fine priest who instructed me. O'Connor was definitely a part of my luggage by that time, for I had learned from Robert Giroux's introduction to the Complete Stories that O'Connor was indeed a devout Catholic. I ain't gonna let no Pope of Rome tell me how to run my dairy. When that same fine priest invited me to replace a priest who was scheduled to teach a class called Religious Themes in Contemporary Literature at the University of Missouri, I relished the chance. For in addition to Eliot, Graham Greene, Nikos Kazantzakis, and others, I taught O'Connor stories for the first time. And to my surprise, the students, for the most part, didn't think she was funny. But today her work is popular in Japan. Who knew? For my part, I was reading reviews and the limited commentary available in the 60s to try to get behind the laughter and search the stories for indications of Catholicism. You know, at first, I didn't find much Catholicism there, at least not on the surface. Surely, though, A Temple of the Holy Ghost is the most overtly Catholic and a fine narrative, maybe O'Connor's best. But onward and upward, I read Caroline Gordon, Richard Gilman in Time magazine, a mysterious and totally laudatory comment by Thomas Merton comparing O'Connor to Aeschylus and Sophocles, and some commentary from the then appreciative Louis Rubin. He later changed his mind about Flannery, alas. Maybe I'll tell you that later. With these sometime guides, I waded in on my own. Over the following 30 years, I've investigated and written a lot on many aspects of O'Connor's work. The Christian, from the presence of the essential messenger figure in many of the stories, with due homage to Walker Percy, to O'Connor's reading of Jacques Maritain and Léon Blois, and to O'Connor's knowledge of the curious spirituality of Simone Weil and the deep conviction and conversion of the Jewish Edith Stein. And on the secular side of the street, the influence through the New Yorker, which O'Connor read avidly, as you know, of James Thurber, Dorothy Parker, and Joseph Mitchell. Also, O'Connor's influence on that wild man, Harry Crews. The parallels with the grotesques in Diane Arbus's photographs. Some parallels also with O'Connor's epistolary friend, Elizabeth Bishop. I was in the collection one day, just reading in one of O'Connor's books, and out fell a postcard, and nobody had found it, and it was a postcard from Savannah from Elizabeth Bishop to Flannery, and I signed E.B., and I was so thrilled, thrill of discovery. And I've also written about Flannery's indebtedness to her friend Marion Lee, that eccentric woman, for the central inspiration of Everything That Rises Must Converge. All of these have been invigorating explorations. The monks of old slept in their coffins, but they wasn't as advanced as we are. So, in my first year at Georgia College, I was filling in for one of O'Connor's favorite teachers, Tommy Maxwell, who was a legend. Tommy had just retired. She's the one who told me the wonderful story of Flannery coming into the first day of a speech class. And Tommy said, "Flannery, are you enrolling in this class?" And Flannery said in her inimitable nasal, "Mama told me to get the nasal out of my voice." She never did. According to Tommy, she as you've heard her, you've heard Flannery read, you know she didn't quite get that nasal out. But she tried. When my friends came here in that first year, I made them go to the campus bookstore and ask for books of Flannery O'Connor, by Flannery O'Connor. The bookstore did not carry her books, but because they said there was no call for them, so I just sent everybody I could think of into the bookstore. The Flannery O'Connor collection, I was directed to the second floor of the library to a sort of semi-kitchen. Under the sink in that kitchen was a cardboard box open at the top with some clippings of Flannery O'Connor. This was, of course, before Regina O'Connor donated the manuscripts in the private library, 1968. I returned in 1973. By then, the Flannery O'Connor collection was officially opened, and in 1974, we had our first O'Connor Symposium featuring Robert Drake, Frederick Aisles, and the very cranky Caroline Gordon. Therein lies a tale or two. While I was learning Flannery O'Connor and teaching her work, I also spent a lot of energy courting the college administration with pleas and exhortations for Flannery's legacy. Her hometown and her alma mater were in many ways quite slow to realize O'Connor's greatness and the boon of having the manuscript collection. Scholars began to trickle in, stream in, and then to pour in. And they discovered, upon arrival, that many of the locals, to my great frustration, referred to Flannery as Regina's daughter who writes, or I never read that crazy lady's work. One revered psychology professor rented rooms to O'Connor scholars, but declared to her visitors that O'Connor was in need of psychological assistance. It was the powerful Sally Fitzgerald who made a call on that very professor and set her straight, as only Sally could. So you can see that the task for me, Rosalie Walston, Mary Barbara Tate, and others, Dory Nelligan, another important person who's recently left us, was a Sisyphean task. For the hard of hearing, you shout. For the almost blind, you draw large and startling figures. Carter Martin wrote one of the best early introductions to O'Connor. Josephine Hendon, Martha Stevens, Claire Kahane Katz, and my great friend Louise Westling were among the first to read O'Connor through familial and feminist lens. Bruce Gentry explored Bakhtinian reading. Other commentators saw parallels between O'Connor and Walker Percy, O'Connor and Eudora Welty and Catherine Ann Porter. Others, like Frederick Cruz in the New York Review of Books, excoriated O'Connor's reputation. Ralph Wood staunchly defended O'Connor's Catholicism through a very Protestant, that is to say Baptist, lens. Gary Chuba and Robert Brinkmeyer have done, in my view, excellent work, especially Brinkmeyer's study of O'Connor and the Fugitives and Agrarians and the New Critics. Just recently, that's to say, on the aspect of eternity, Paul Ely included Flannery in his work on 4 Catholic writers, The Life You Say May Be Your Own, and then turned around a few years ago with a New Yorker piece and lamented what he considered to be O'Connor's racism. Angela Alamo O'Donnell's radical ambiguity was the catalyst for Ely's rebuke, and O'Donnell quickly countered Ely's charge. For about 20 years, Sally Fitzgerald, who gave us the wonderful habit of being, worked on O'Connor's biography, but died before it was finished, as did William Sessions, who had been given the assignment after Sally's death. Brad Gooch, with no cooperation from O'Connor's family, gave us a long-awaited biography. There will be more to come, especially with Carol Schloss's work on the relationship between Flannery and the intrepid Regina, and with your work, wherever it leads you. A man with a good car don't need to be justified. So get yourself a good car. memorable one-liners, and an assembly of the bizarre, the outrageous, and the very familiar. That's O'Connor. There is, however, that one hard line. In her words, what people don't realize is how much religion costs. They think faith is a big electric blanket, when of course it is the cross. And I am no disbeliever in spiritual purpose and no vague believer. I see from the standpoint of Christian orthodoxy. This means that for me, the meaning of life is centered in our redemption by Christ, and what I see in the world, I see in relation to that. That one hard line. It's a line many of us never cross. A line that many of us are simply not able to cross. I crossed it once, long ago, and then retreated. That line, of course, is Flannery O'Connor's devout Catholicism. We can talk and write about her humor and her one-liners and call them back and forth to each other until the cows come home. But we simply cannot ignore O'Connor's radical faith. A faith that quite honestly underlies everything she wrote and is evident in the harshness, the unrelenting and sardonic descriptions, often cataclysmic, of a fallen world. This view is certainly hard to take for many who call themselves Christian and even Catholic. It is even harder to take for those non-believers who teach O'Connor at the college level. Yet Flannery O'Connor, for all her forays into the strange and outrageous, had what I've called elsewhere an obedient imagination. Some of us who are writers like to leave expectation and conventional belief behind. Some of us like to explore for the sake of exploring. We enjoy that freedom, or we think we do. We say we do. But Flannery O'Connor, for all the hyperbole, the snark, the brilliance of that very dark view of earthly existence without God, had an obedient imagination. Obedient, and imaginative. Obedience and imagination. Those two sticks rub together and create flame, fire. When I helped Sally Fitzgerald in the editing of The Habit of Being back in the late 70s, and I read O'Connor's letters for the first time, I was absolutely knocked flat. Oh yes, they are humorous. They contain much important commentary on the writer's craft. But above all, they convey a deep and to me enviable and frightening spirituality, then and now. I couldn't get beyond that. The letters made me laugh, they inspired me, and in some profound sense, they defeated me. Not because I was reading another person's private correspondence, but really because I did not and could not share that bone-deep faith, that confidence in a numinous providence, and that certainty in the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. You see, though I had converted to Catholicism 10 years earlier, I had fallen away with a thud. I have never been able to return, I confess. Today, when I reread O'Connor's letters, I have a sinking feeling that verges on dismay, even anger. Anger at her bold belief, her confidence, at what I consider to be one of her own sins of omission, especially in Jesus' identification with the oppressed, the downtrodden, the pariahs. Jesus' association with the poor, with those for whom there is no justice. And that's my confession. But I must add this. We cannot teach or talk about O'Connor's work without acknowledging the incredible faith that is the scaffolding of every bit of it. We may detour into the humor, scour the allusions to other writers and to the Bible, talk about comic timing, her use of local color in the local colorist tradition, her treatment of African American characters, poor white trash, women, ad infinitum. But we cannot leave the classroom or the critical essay without acknowledging the one hard line, not politically correct. We can't proselytize, but we must clarify and elucidate, just as we might do when reading and teaching Gerard Manley Hopkins. That's a tough assignment for many of us who hail from the realms of secular humanism and the Great Enlightenment. Yet we have to present O'Connor honestly, from her own perspective, even if we find our task difficult or even repugnant. If the Eucharist is just a symbol, I say to hell with it. I remember with some fondness the intense conversations Bill Sessions and I had regarding the real presence in the Eucharist. For you know Bill Sessions, too, was a convert and a very devout one. He and Flannery believed in the real presence in the Eucharist. There is that hard line, you know. Oh, where indeed are the Catholic characters, you ask? Perhaps that bumbling priest, Father Finn of the Enduring Chill, is the truest voice of the author. He's rather the inversion of the misfit, if you will. The misfit has made his choice. He has grasped the options. Jesus thrown everything off balance. He is the doubting Thomas to the extreme, the nihilist par excellence. He has decided no pleasure but meanness. But in the Enduring Chill, Father Finn from Purgatory puts the question to that sorry Asbury, who in some ways seems almost a hyperbolic O'Connor, who also came home sick. Are you so ignorant you haven't heard of the Holy Ghost? The priest asked. Certainly I've heard of the Holy Ghost, and the Holy Ghost is the last thing I'm looking for. And he may be the last thing you get, the priest said, his fierce one eye inflamed. Do you want your soul to suffer eternal damnation? Do you want to be deprived of God for all eternity? Do you want to suffer the most terrible pain, greater than fire, the pain of loss? Do you want to suffer the pain of loss for all eternity? Asbury moved his arms and legs helplessly, as if he were pinned to the bed by the terrible eye. How can the Holy Ghost fill your soul when it's full of trash? The priest roared. The Holy Ghost will not come until you see yourself as you are. A lazy, ignorant, conceited youth, he said, pounding his fist on the little bedside table. Asbury does get the Holy Ghost in one of O'Connor's less violent, but nonetheless stunning endings. He doesn't get the book literally thrown at him. He doesn't die at the hands of an escaped convict. He doesn't drown in the river. He doesn't get abandoned at a roadside cafe, nor does he get gored by the green-leaf bull. Nonetheless, the urgency is there. The humiliating encounter with his sinful self is there for Asbury, and we are all indicted once again. O'Connor's Catholicism was conservative. It was the stringent sort, the demanding St. John of the Cross sort, the Simone Weil and Edith Stein sort. Weil never converted, but she might as well have done. And O'Connor's Catholicism is not that of the mature and increasingly ecumenical Thomas Merton, not that of Richard Rohr, not that of one of my heroes, James Carroll, wonderful book he wrote, The Truth at the Heart of the Lie, about the current state of the Catholic Church, former priest, commercial. Not Sister Joan Chittister or Father James Martin. Maybe not even the side of Pope Francis that many of us admire. O'Connor doesn't just tap us on the shoulder. She throws our shoulder out of joint. She writes, and we must not look away, one of the effects of modern liberal Protestantism has been gradually to turn religion into poetry and therapy, to make truth vaguer and more relative, to banish intellectual distinctions, to depend on feeling instead of thought, and gradually to come to believe that God has no power, that he cannot communicate with us, he cannot reveal himself to us, indeed has not done so, and that religion is our own sweet invention. And she writes, quote, I have found in short from reading my own writing that my subject in fiction is the action of grace in territory largely held by the devil. Think about that. I have also found that what I write is read by an audience which puts little stock either in grace or the devil. You discover your audience at the same time and in the same way that you discover your subject, but it is an added blow. And finally this one. For me, it is the virgin birth, she writes, the incarnation, the resurrection, which are the true laws of the flesh and the physical. Death, decay, destruction are the suspension of these laws. I am always astonished at the emphasis the church puts on the body. It is not the soul, she says, that will rise, but the body glorified. O'Connor's Catholicism was not the sort of liberal Catholic theology that some of us value today. The Catholicism of a gentle and loving God. Her God is stern and demanding, but not as Dorothy Day or Daniel Berrigan's God is demanding. No social action, no calls for racial justice, not the social gospel. O'Connor's youthful prayer journal demonstrates her own sense of woeful spiritual inadequacy, her profound sense of her need to please God, her drastic spiritual self-laceration. Quote, when I think of all I have to be thankful for, she says to God, I wonder that you just don't kill me now because you've done so much for me already and I haven't been particularly grateful. She is a worm before God. She understands heaven only because she understands hell. Grace can be achieved only through pain and suffering. She writes in that youthful journal, give me the courage to stand the pain to get the grace. This worrisome, at least worrisome to me, conjunction of suffering, pain, and grace becomes the foundation of O'Connor's fiction. Furthermore, O'Connor's recently published correspondence to her mother Regina from her graduate years in Iowa underscores her painstaking adherence to the teaching and practices of the church, and these letters suggest that Regina was, in many ways, Flannery's spiritual guide in her first years away from home. She advised her daughter on what she was allowed to ingest on Fridays, on the proper attire for attendance at weekly Mass, and on holy days. When O'Connor was at Yaddo, she attended daily Mass very early every morning with the staff, the cooks, and others. The later letters in the habit of being continue the conservative way of thinking, bolstered, of course, by O'Connor's reading in theology and her review of theological works in the Georgia Diocesan Bulletin. There is no gentle Jesus, meek and mild, and it is important to note still no evidence of the message of Jesus for social justice and equality. She cannot meet James Baldwin in Georgia. She is harsh in criticism of Dorothy Day's visit to the interracial community Koinonia in West Georgia. She is socially inactive. Yes, she is ill, but she does not use her growing reputation to challenge the racial status quo. Perhaps it is inappropriate, even wrong, to take O'Connor to task. My point here, however, is simply to emphasize her social and religious conservatism, the frequent jokes with Marriott Lee to the contrary notwithstanding. The institution in which O'Connor places her trust is conservative and does not change its core teaching over time. It draws a hard line. As a recent commentary in the New York Times noted, quote, "It doesn't seem uncharitable to remind liberal Catholics that the Catholic Church is by self-definition a structure of hierarchical authority run by a single man who holds the keys of heaven given by Jesus to St. Peter. If that's not a conservative institution," this writer concludes, "I don't know what is." As an aside, I'm reminded of a fine essay about the Sufi poet Rumi in the New Yorker a few years back. You may have read this. In that essay, the author rather openly laments the fact that interpreters and biographers of Rumi have almost singularly neglected to point out the poet's Islamic heritage. She reminds us that Rumi's most successful popularizer in America, Coleman Barks, just up the road in Athens, neither reads nor writes Persian. Instead, he translates 19th century translations into American verse, and he often omits Islamic references. Omad Safi, professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic studies at Duke, argues that in the 19th century, the West began to uncouple mystical poetry from its Islamic roots, and concludes that reading Rumi without the Quran is like reading Milton without the Bible. I believe that something similar frequently happens, if not often occurs, when scholars and teachers present O'Connor. Unless they are in a Catholic environment, a community or university, say, they and we are likely to put aside O'Connor's Catholicism, ignore it altogether, or pass it off as some more accessible and comfortable form of Christianity. I plead guilty to having done that in the past, especially with classes that seemed unfailingly Protestant and with little understanding of the history of the church. More than once, I've had a student claim that O'Connor was not Christian, she was a Catholic. Furthermore, even those scholars who acknowledge the Catholic basis of O'Connor's aesthetic do not often emphasize its fierce, stringent demands, its very urgency. She would have been a good woman if there had been somebody to shoot her every day of her life. Ruby Turpin sees the parade into heaven, and that even the virtues of the clean, like her and Claude, are being burned away. If this is a medieval view of Catholicism, as Martha Stevens long ago observed, so be it. Dantean, by way of the illustrations of Hieronymus Bosch or Gustave Doré. I think one of the reasons we as teachers tend to perform various gestures of averting our students' eyes from O'Connor's faith and to rely on her comedy and common Christian beliefs is that we prefer avoiding presenting the foundation of her work as uncompromising, honestly demanding, and rigorously conservative. I've come to believe that we should teach her as we might teach Dante and his Catholicism, or Camus and his existentialism, or Rumi or Tolstoy. If we are going to buttress our arguments in making any interpretation of O'Connor's work by using her letters or her prayer journal or the essays, we need to include the whole context of her remarks. For example, when in that fine introduction to a memoir of Mary Ann, O'Connor concludes that tenderness cut off from the source of tenderness leads to the gas chamber, we must surely acknowledge that for Flannery O'Connor, the source of tenderness is Jesus Christ, not community spirit or a compassionate secular humanism. That statement shows us unequivocally where O'Connor stands. In issuing statements like these, she likely appeals to fundamentalists and evangelicals, though of course, for Flannery, the knowledge and love of Christ Jesus is mediated only through the Roman Catholic Church. Hazel Motes may have been on the right track at the end of his journey, but he has not the guidance and teaching of the church, and thus his life may be seen as tragic. His instincts are good, and perhaps he is not a lost soul. I prefer to think he's not. We can only assume as much through Mrs. Flood's sense that in his suffering and death, Hazel Motes was on to something. As O'Connor herself wrote, right now, and this seems so relevant, right now the whole world is going through a dark night of the soul. All human nature resists grace because grace changes us, and the change is painful, and the truth does not change according to our ability to stomach it. We need to remember that, in my humble opinion. Hers is a dark view of the world, not Manichaean, but a place where the good is always under construction. I don't believe that O'Connor was a saint, as some are attempting to prove as we speak, but she was a prophet, posting an angry rebuke to a sorry world. She saw too clearly the fault lines, felt the earth's seismic trembling, and we must not dismiss that vision in our teaching and talk about her work, whether we like it or agree with it or not. That truth, for Flannery O'Connor, resides in the unchanging teachings of the church. O'Connor's fiction and nonfiction may seem, in this light, anachronistic and not woke. But, as we often say, it is what it is. Thank you.
We have time for some questions or comments from you. Please wave at me. I'll bring you the microphone. Otherwise, the streamers cannot hear your questions. So the floor is open.
Hi, Dr. Gordon. Thanks so much. I'm Colin Cutler, and actually raised Pentecostal by an ex-Catholic mother, and I find a lot of my own upbringing in O'Connor.
You're a musician, aren't you?
Yes, ma'am, I am. Yes. So, as has been mentioned a couple times this week, there's the joke that in the split between the Catholic Church and the Protestants, Catholics got the Bible, and the Catholics got the Church and the Protestants got the Bible. And I was wondering, how valuable have you found it for your students to have a knowledge of the Bible as opposed to tradition in approaching O'Connor?
Oh, I think students of every writer should have knowledge of the Bible.
Yes.
I mean, I lament the fact that that seems to be going away now. Thank you. Is that your question? I'm sorry, I was making a little transition here from...
Yes.
standing to decrepitude.
Yes, basically. I guess how much imagery do you feel that she pulls from the Bible directly as opposed from stories of the saints?
As you know, you probably know that Catholics in Flannery's day were not encouraged to read the Bible on their own. The priest, reads does the readings in Mass and interprets those readings. That's been true since the Middle Ages. So Catholics are not encouraged, have never been encouraged to go out and read the Bible on their own. Probably they do it more now than they've ever done it. But it's the teaching of the clerical hierarchy that's the instruction. In other words, the idea being that, the idea being that, oh, you can read the Bible and interpret it any way you want to. That's what Annie J. Holy says in Wise Blood, And that's a commentary on the notion that anybody can read the Bible. Catholics have not traditionally believed that. So she wouldn't have been digging around. She would have been digging around maybe in Thomas Aquinas, who's above my pay level, but not the Bible.
Sorry. One more quick question too.
Sure.
There's this image that's kind of repeated. Throughout her stories of this unseen force that's terrifying to people involved in thinking of Greenleaf, Mrs. May. Long before the bull ever shows up, when she first encounters Mrs. May, there's this. I forget exactly the word that she uses, but it's her first sense of the divine, right? And then there's the terrible speed of mercy and similar images like View of the Woods and things like that. I was curious, did she ever read Francis Thompson's Hound of Heaven? Are you sure?
Oh, I'm sure she knew of it.
Okay.
I'm sure of that. I thought of that a lot too when I reread Flannery. I think yes, it's like Hazel Motes is pursued the way the Hound of Heaven pursues us all. So I don't know that she had it in her library, but I'm sure she was familiar with it as I was growing up.
Cool. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I'm Christine Atkins. I'm part of the Institute. I just have a quick practical question. And I'm definitely guilty of teaching O'Connor, in secular ways and kind of skipping over the Catholicism, despite being raised Roman Catholic. How much time, just practically, should we take to explain Catholicism in the context before teaching, even one or two of her stories?
Well, I think that's a very good question. Maybe some outside reading and just the history of the church and who St. Peter was and the apostolic line and that kind of thing. I've done quick things like that, with my students when I've been teaching Dante, the part of the Divine Comedy that I taught in World Lit. And sometimes I've done it in teaching O'Connor. The thing is, you don't read Flannery to find the structure of the Roman Catholic Church. You just see her particular brand, to me, of Catholicism is such a, I don't want to say rigid, but it's rigid. It's a rigid view. And so after you explain some little bit of the history of the church, you have to say, there are various ways of being Catholic. Her kind was very conservative, and part of that, I must say, is the family connection. Is her mother. I mean, her mother was as strict a Catholic as I've ever known, and I knew her somewhat. And she schooled Flannery. So what Flannery felt about the practices of the church, she got from her very controlling mother. That's a winding answer to your question. So it's not an easy thing to do, and you don't know where people are coming from. What tradition they're coming from.
Hi.
Hard to see them all.
Thank you for that talk. That was really enlightening. I want to ask kind of about something you said really early on about how you recognized a lot of those characters in your kind of upbringing in your hometown. That's my experience as well. I'm curious, and you also said that you were kind of running away from that was where you didn't want to end up. And I'm curious if your relationship, kind of your own view of your community that you grew up in has changed as you've read O'Connor and as you've kind of reflected on her works since then. If your kind of beliefs, your view, your relationship to where you're from has shifted reading O'Connor.
That's a good question. I did think, and I still think Flannery is just hilarious. Maybe that's the snarky side of me, but, I just really enjoy that. And I first enjoyed it, and then I recognized people in the doctor's waiting room, and a lot of people don't realize that in Revelation, that's a segregated waiting room. The black people are in one room, and the white folks are in somewhere else. And it was maybe 3 or 4 times, and I read and talked about that story, then I thought, that's like Dr. Garrison's office where I worked in the summer in college. I was the receptionist, and the blacks were in this room, and the whites were in this room, and it just dawned on me. So, yes, there's that kind of shock of recognition. I've been there, I know these people, this could happen. But the other thing that's happened with me, and you're all too young to know this, most of you, is that you get mellowed out the older you get. You take a kindlier view. And Flannery didn't live to be my age. You just, you become more accepting of anti-intellectualism and provincialism and ugliness. When you realize everybody's carrying a burden, all those cliches are true after all. So I think a lot of that is my age now. And Flannery didn't, she died when she was 39. Think about it. Some of you are not even, 20? Got a long way to go.
Hey, Professor.
I can't see you all.
Hey,
I'm just seeing the light.
I'm this big guy in the middle.
Yes.
Hi. Hey, Professor Gordon. My name is Matt. I'm with the NEH Institute, and this will sound like a big old question, and in some ways, I think you've answered it with your talk. But I thought maybe I would frame it this way. I think there are just some really unique qualities about O'Connor scholarship. I think it's a really unique field, and if you meet people from other currents, there are just some distinctives, I think, in what we do that I think are just really great. What sort of hopes would you have for O'Connor scholarship as you've left this incredible legacy in our field and continue to contribute by coming to speak with us? What hopes would you have for O'Connor scholarship going forward? And then what is a fear that you have about O'Connor scholarship going forward? Like I said, big old question, but I thought maybe I would ask it that way and just see how you'd respond.
That's an excellent question. I wish I were a prophet. Bruce could probably answer, what's happening better in O'Connor scholarship now than I can, although I have kept up somewhat in my retirement. I was fearful back in the 70s that the church was going to take Flannery over. I have to be very candid about that. I was very worried because there were a lot of priests and nuns, commenting and writing about O'Connor, and it worried me. And then, of course, Ralph Wood came in. He's a Baptist, but he's also a very conservative Christian. So the field sort of evened out, more. I always wanted the Flannery O'Connor Bulletin and the Flannery O'Connor Review to be open. I didn't want it to be, because we were here at Flannery's alma mater and her mother lived right down the street. I didn't want it to be a mouthpiece for the church or, for any one particular point of view. So that was my intent, and that's one reason when we transformed the bulletin into the Flannery O'Connor Review, we opened it up to scholarship of O'Connor and other people and artists and writers and so on, because I think we could become a little claustrophobic You know, Flannery left a limited body of work. 31 stories, 2 novels, letters, essays, now her youthful diary and all that. But it's still limited. And so I felt that the journal should push its way open and out. And Bruce, I think, has done a terrific job. I helped create it, and I walked off and left him with the job. He's done a great job. Sorry he's retiring this year. Well, am I not supposed to say that? I don't know.
Dr. Gordon, thank you so much for everything you've done to get us all here today, because I think we wouldn't be without your work and so many others. My name's Dorian Speed. I'm a student at the University of St. Thomas here for the Institute.
Good.
And I was wondering if you could maybe clarify or expand upon what you were saying about that you did not see Christ's identification with the downtrodden and pariahs in O'Connor as regards her portrayal of suffering as redemptive, and whether you see, if suffering is redemptive, if that means that we don't have a responsibility to those who are suffering because they are, cooperating with their. Because I feel like we could see kind of a rebuke of those who do not respond to those who are suffering or see themselves as superior in her work.
My comments about that are based largely on her private correspondence and the invitation for James Baldwin to come, and she refuses that. But she was actually in a state Georgia, where people like Lillian Smith were standing up and fighting the whole racial inequality problem. And she also knew that that's what Dorothy Day was doing over at Cornelia, and she kept quiet about it. Now, part of that, I think, was her situation. She was living with Regina. Regina had very firm ideas about politics and religion, and it was very difficult for Flannery, who was ill, to in any way put herself out in social activism. I understand that. But it's also interesting to me that she wouldn't have even, in many of the letters, she has absolutely no interest in the civil rights movement. Except, she says, folks in Millersville are taking a keen interest in education now, burning crosses in people's front yards, the Klan and so forth. I mean, there was a kind of wryness and a kind of maybe even condescension. Though Marriott Lee, God bless her, did force Flannery to think about these things. Though she kind of, makes fun of Marriott. She loved Marriott. I think that Marriott Lee was one of the great friendships of her life, much more so than a friendship with A or Cecil Dawkins. It was Marriott Lee of whom Flannery was really, really fond. And Marriott did a lot to poke her, because Marriott was going to sit-ins and being social active. Now that's a long, winding answer to, not really an answer to your question. Maybe I wanted Flannery to be ahead of her time, but some people here were. Ralph McGill, Lillian Smith, and, Dorothy Day with the Catholic Worker Movement and so on. And Koinonia, if you don't know about that interracial community in West Georgia, it was started by Clarence Jordan, and it's still going on. And that was an incredible venture. Jimmy Carter did a lot to encourage it, but it was an incredible venture in the 60s, I think in the 60s, when these white and black people decided they were going to live communally together. You can imagine what an outburst, local outburst that caused. I'm sorry, I'm putting my hand up so I can see people. I want to see lights. I could never have been a movie star or a theater star. I miss my calling.
So next is me, the bad penny.
Okay.
Kel Carpenter, former student of Dr. Gordon's. I've lived in Milledgeville now almost as long as Flannery was alive, which is weird to think. I would like to get someone who lived in Milledgeville for quite a while. Your thoughts on how Milledgeville sort of imprints itself on people who spend a lot of time here, and how that may have been part of Flannery's muse, so to speak.
Well, I'll just quote Sally Fitzgerald. Some of you know this statement. Sally and I were going out to lunch one day, and I can't remember that restaurant that used to be out on 441. Anyway, we were driving out, and Sally had just been visiting for a couple of times, and she, was a very sophisticated, wonderful person. And we were talking. She said, Sarah, she said, I know where Flannery got all her ideas. She was like a silver miner at the Comstock Lode. and it is true. I've lived in several communities, but I've never seen a community quite as interesting and eccentric and wonderful. If you are a writer, just stay here. I mean, it is, I've been away for a while now, but I'm living in Athens now, but there's stories to be told. I mean, it is an incredible Comstock Lode. So, yes, Kel, I would say she got a lot of influence. She was influenced quite a lot by people that she came in contact with, for better or worse.
Sarah, we have a question from an online viewer who actually wanted you to comment on something. So he said he's troubled by the prospect that O'Connor's work will be sanitized by the art police. And he wanted to know what you thought of that.
By the what police?
Art police.
Oh, that's a horrible thought, isn't it? Yeah, right. That she'll be next. Well, I don't want people to say the artificial blank. That was Flannery's. That was the word that was used in her time, and I cannot encourage that kind of censorship. I think it's horrible. And I had a tussle with a recent staff member here about using the artificial blank. And I said, no, the story is the artificial nigger. You wouldn't change Joseph Conrad's, the nigger of the Narcissus, with the blank and the Narcissus. That didn't make any sense to me. So I'm worried about all of this, trigger warnings and book banning and so forth. I think it's horrible. Horrible. Enough said.
Hi, Dr. Gordon. Thank you for your talk. My name's Madison Peshock. I'm from Toms River, New Jersey, and I'm with the NEH, and I teach community college. And besides teaching full-time there, I have a lot of administrative duties, and as part of my administrative duties, I mentor adjunct faculty, and I hold a round table once a month in which we take a story or two and we talk about how to teach it and things like that. And I'm very eager to get back and share everything that I'm learning. But as I mentor a lot of these new faculty, adjunct faculty, almost no one puts O'Connor on their syllabi, which I think is sad. And when I've talked to them at the roundtables, they'll say, well, she uses the N-word, or they're not going to get it because the South is so different from us in Toms River, or no, they don't get the Catholic references. Nobody wants to teach her. Even some of the tenured faculty don't teach her. And I find that so sad. So how could I persuade, what would you say to persuade faculty to teach Flannery O'Connor? Because I just love her. And I always teach A Good Man's Hard to Find or Good Country People.
Well, this has been happening for some time. For 30 years I've been hearing these reports from oh, they say she's a honky writer, blah, 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 you know. Racist, racist, racist. You have to me, you have to take a writer for what she or he gives, the domain, what is the given, what is the scene, what is the setting? Is this the segregated South with a segregated waiting room? When was this? 1940, 1950? Is there any historical context we can bring to this? I would say that's a way in. I'm glad I'm not teaching anymore, I'll tell you the truth.
Oftentimes when I teach A Good Man's Hard to Find, I actually pause, and right before we talk about Lazarus, when the Misfits talking about that, I show the scene of Jesus raising Lazarus from Jesus of Nazareth with Robert Powell playing Jesus, so they get the reference, because otherwise they wouldn't get it.
Amazing. Well, these are troubling times to me. I can't imagine when I was an undergraduate saying to one of my professors, I'm not going to read so-and-so because, you know, he owned slaves, or, you know, it's so knee-jerk, simple-minded to me. I just have to say that. I'm an old fogey. Read it and learn. Read it and learn how somebody else thinks. Learn how a racist thinks. Learn how it feels to be oppressed. Learn how it feels to be a displaced person. We're all displaced people, of course. But anybody else? About quitting time, isn't it?
If I could just offer a perspective on this, not the last question, but the question prior to that. I think I'm also the darkest person in this room. And I teach at a community college where a lot of my students come from a lot of different backgrounds. And on the one hand, I completely agree with you. You know, we should approach the author as they were, you know, with what they've got to offer. And, you know, O'Connor was very much writing the words of the people that she was around. And I, you know, completely respect and appreciate, you know, that she was being true to what they would say. I would also have a really hard time getting any of my, a good half to 2/3 of my students to even approach her when they see that word, not because they don't think that she brings something of value, but because, and not because they're thinking of it in terms of woke ideology, but just in terms of they don't want to hear that word applied to them. And thinking about who we want to read O'Connor, thinking about audience, this is something that I think about a lot as a musician. You know, it's like, I'm going to write what I want to write. I'm not going to, it's not going to be for everybody, right? But then I go out and find that audience. I would rather have them reading O'Connor and taking the good things that they can draw from her than the guy that I've had at a gig come up to me and be like, oh yeah, I love O'Connor. You know why I love her? I'm like, why? He says, because she writes the N-word. I'm like, well, there are a lot of good reasons to like O'Connor. That's not one of them. So, you know, I think as we think about censorship, you know, I don't think she should be banned. And I'm not even wholly sure that we should get rid of the words particularly, you know, and or completely blank them out. Or, you know, it could be first letter and then blank, right? N dash, P dash, right? But thinking in terms of, again, who we want to read and appreciate her, and for what reasons. And I do think that could be something we could consider as well.
Sure. You know, I worry about Faulkner a lot. And I can't sleep at night. I worry about people not reading Faulkner anymore. I know, it's ridiculous, isn't it? But it's true. Anybody else?
We have one more online. Can we
Okay.
get back there?
Bob, bless you. It's kind of like Phil Donahue or something.
I know. He's doing great work. So we have an online viewer who asks about the one hard line in Revelation. Ruby Turpin experiences a prophetic vision in which those whom she despises enter heaven first. Is there any sense that this vision suggests a certain humility in O'Connor's worldview even in regard to Catholic doctrine?
Oh, yes. I mean, the answer is yes. I was on Flannery's birthday about 10 years ago. I was sitting in the student union here with one of Flannery's relatives, and she had just read Revelation, and she was just amazed that Ruby Turpin realized that even their virtues were being burned away. And so, what I'm saying is, when it hits you that Ruby Turpin, that she and her husband are at the back of the line, but they're the only ones singing on key. There is a real, and that's a wonderful O'Connor story. That story, funny as it is deeply, is profound to me. And I think that story and A Temple of the Holy Ghost and perhaps The River are among the tenderest of O'Connor stories. I mean, there is that sense of vulnerability and kindness underneath those stories.
Professor Gordon, thank you so much.
Thank you, Bob.
Could you give her a round of applause? I don't know how long she's going to stay, but if somebody doesn't ask her about strong women in Milledgeville and in O'Connor, I'm going to pop.
Strong women in Milledgeville
And in O'Connor.
and in O'Connor. Oh,
But that's
another day.
Thank you for being here tonight. We have another lecture on Monday night. I hope you'll come back. We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you so much.